I want to talk a little bit about the process. And I'm kind of curious to know just, you're obviously a very experienced probate attorney. You're the kind of probate attorney I would want to hire. And I'm just wondering, as people are going through the process, what are some mistakes that you see people making? They've already the decedent, they're passed away. They have the will, or maybe there's no will. They're in process with you. They've retained you for your services. Now they're your client. They're in process. What are some things that you've noticed, that mistakes that people have made, things that you wish that other people would know about, as they're entering this process?
Mm. One is to get organized with the decedent's affairs if you can. So there's always, depends. You talked about foreclosure. Sometimes there's instances where you just have to jump in and get this ball going. But mostly if you have the ability to wait, get organized first to try to see how much of the decedent's assets you can have access to ahead of time. See what is holding you up, meaning if there's a bank account that has a beneficiary listed, usually through the process, you can just get that account transferred and it never touches probate or goes to court at all. So I advise families to try to do that first. Try to see how much can you do without involving the court. Because also there's some tools, and in Texas we have something called a muniment of title, which is a more simplified version of probate. It's quicker, it's usually cheaper, and it applies but only to a limited situation. It does not appoint an executor, so that's why it's important to have a real understanding of what you need to have access to ahead of time. Because if a family does that easier muniment of title to maybe like just move the house, but then they end up finding that there's a bank account later, well, now we don't have an executor to get that account. So really getting organized with what do we have and what do we really need to go to probate for first is probably the main thing I would advise families for.
Okay. And what about dealing with other heirs? And a lot of
Mm.
times, what I find, just to give you a little insight in kind of my business here at Kritt Real Estate, Texas Probate Real Estate, one of the things I find interesting is when I have a prospective client come to me, and we're talking, and I want to know about the property. I want to know, but I also want to know about the estate, insofar as, like, who's involved here. Am I going to get a call from,
Yeah.
drunk Uncle Joe, which has happened? Drunk Uncle Joe has called me. Okay. Is there craziness here? Now, I don't mind crazy real estate. By the way, I don't know if you know this, Keely, real estate is crazy. And so, I always know there's going to be some, because we're dealing with people, right? We're dealing with
Mhm.
people. We're dealing with all the, messiness of human life, with the real estate transaction. And usually they're under pressure when they're doing it, because selling a house, even buying a house, but selling a house in the case of probate real estate, it's very stressful. They're dealing with all the legal things. They're dealing a lot of times with loss. Not always. Sometimes the executor is very distant from the situation, but usually they are pretty close.
Yeah, involved.
And yeah, yeah. And then they have also the selling of the house. Sometimes they never even sold a house before, right? There's all kinds of things going on. But I always ask about, how many heirs are there? Are you guys getting along?
Mm.
Because I wanna know, because a lot of times I find, even if there's an executor, an appointed person, they're operating in consensus with the other people involved, the people who are gonna benefit from the sale. And sometimes maybe it's not a contested probate, but there is some disagreement on, like, what should happen, how it should happen. I always try to get those people together on, when I do a listing appointment with that kind of, that situation. Once I've kind of figured out that, okay, there's 2 other brothers or sisters involved, and they're talking to them a lot, and it's like, okay, I want them on the call. I want them with us at this appointment, right? So I always wanna know what's going on, but conflict is very, very common in these situations.